Welcome to Echoes of War, and in this video, we will be covering the Battle of Gettysburg and a general's final gamble. Y'all enjoy.
In May of 1863, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had just pulled off a tactical masterpiece at Chancellorsville. Looking at the battlefield, the Confederate forces appeared completely invincible. But that battlefield reputation hid a collapsing home front. Draft laws allowed wealthy plantation owners to avoid military service by paying substitutes, forcing poor farmers to the front lines. The resulting collapse in the local food supply left their wives leading literal bread riots across major southern cities. Out west, the situation was even worse. Ulysses S. Grant was bearing down on the fortress of Vicksburg. If that city fell, Union forces would completely control the Mississippi River, severing Texas's critical supplies of horses and beef and splitting the Confederacy in half. The South was mathematically running out of time. They lacked the manpower and the resources to sustain a prolonged defensive campaign, forcing Confederate leadership into a desperate corner. Rather than sending his troops west to try and save Vicksburg, Lee decided on a massive gamble. He would push his army north across the Potomac to physically loot untouched northern farms for the food and supplies his men desperately needed. He also had a psychological target. Lee regularly read anti-war northern newspapers, the Copperhead Press, which wildly exaggerated northern war weariness. Relying on this flawed intelligence, he calculated that a single major victory on northern soil would shatter Union morale and force a peace treaty. Then there was the geopolitical objective. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston was still open to formally recognizing the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. Lee knew he needed a decisive victory on Union territory to convince Palmerston to officially intervene. This northern invasion was the South's final, all-or-nothing play to win the war in a single stroke, before their internal economic and social collapse destroyed them from within. The campaign almost immediately ran into trouble. Lee's cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, went off on an unauthorized ride to restore his troopers' damaged egos. This left Lee strategically blind. Without proper reconnaissance, his advancing infantry accidentally stumbled right into Union cavalry at a Pennsylvania crossroads town called Gettysburg. This diagram shows the topography of the battlefield. The newly appointed Union commander, General George Meade, recognized the value of the hills south of town. He quickly secured the high ground, arranging his troops along the ridges into a formidable 3-mile-long defensive line shaped exactly like a fishhook. This geometry gave Meade a massive tactical advantage, known as interior lines. If Lee attacked at the outer edges, Union reinforcements didn't have to march all the way around the perimeter. They could just cut straight across the inner curve of the fishhook, plugging any gaps long before the Confederates could break through. For 2 days, Lee tried to break those lines. He was working with newly promoted corps commanders, who struggled to interpret his characteristically vague orders. As a result, the Confederate assaults against the Union flanks were disconnected and poorly timed. The combat down on the flanks devolved into brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Confederate troops fought bitterly over harsh geographical anchors, like the massive boulders of Devil's Den, taking incredibly heavy losses to gain almost no strategic advantage. Between the punishing high ground and Meade's defensive geometry, the Union Army absorbed the Confederate momentum. Lee was exhausted, frustrated, and running out of supplies, setting the stage for a desperate final act. By the morning of Day 3, Lee had exhausted his attacks on the flanks. Running out of time, he made a fatal calculation. Since Meade had been aggressively reinforcing the edges of the fishhook, the Union center had to be depleted. He ordered a massive frontal assault directly at that center line. He chose an unengaged division led by General George Pickett to spearhead the attack, sending them straight across a mile of completely open ground. To weaken the defenders, the Confederates unleashed the largest artillery barrage of the entire war. But thick smoke obscured their vision, and most of their cannons fired far over the heads of the Union infantry, leaving the frontline defenses intact. Around 2 in the afternoon, 15,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the tree line. They formed up shoulder to shoulder and marched steadily toward the Union lines across the exposed farmland. The moment they were in range, Union cannons opened fire. With no cover available, explosive shells and solid iron shot tore massive, bloody gaps right through the advancing Confederate columns. The men who survived the artillery fire made it as far as a low stone wall along the ridge. There, entrenched Union infantry rose up and poured devastating crossfire into their ranks from three sides. The assault collapsed almost instantly. In less than an hour, the Confederate Army lost 8,000 soldiers on that field. As the shattered remnants of the division stumbled back toward the tree line, the era of Southern momentum ended. Pickett's charge physically broke the myth of Confederate invincibility. The battle concluded with a staggering combined toll of 51,000 casualties across 3 days. Back on the ridge, a devastated Robert E. Lee rode among the survivors, telling them the failure was entirely his fault. This chart breaks down the fatal arithmetic for the South. Gettysburg wiped out a third of Lee's entire fighting force. With Southern states already struggling to find able-bodied men and supply lines collapsing, the Confederacy simply lacked the population and infrastructure to replace those losses. As Lee's battered army began a miserable retreat through the pouring rain on July 4th, a second catastrophic blow landed. Vicksburg had finally surrendered to Grant. The Union now completely controlled the Mississippi River, permanently splitting the Confederacy in two. The geopolitical hopes of the South vanished just as quickly. When reports of the dual disasters reached Europe, Lord Palmerston quietly and permanently took the option of British recognition off the table. Just a few months later, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to the site of the slaughter. Standing before a massive crowd to dedicate the new national cemetery, he used his Gettysburg address to rededicate the moral purpose of the war. The fighting would grind on for nearly 2 more grueling years, but Gettysburg permanently destroyed the South's capacity to launch major offensives. With their numbers depleted, their supply lines cut, and no foreign aid coming, the Confederacy was now trapped in a slow, inevitable retreat to defeat.